The cold concrete walls of Camp Justice echoed with the sound of footsteps as dawn broke over Baghdad on December 30th, 2006. In a few hours, one of the most controversial executions in modern history would unfold, marking the end of an era that had gripped Iraq and the world for over 3 decades. The rise and fall of a dictator, Saddam Hussein Abd al-Majid al-Tikriti, had ruled Iraq with an iron fist since 1979, transforming from a young revolutionary into one of the world's most feared dictators. His regime was characterized by brutal suppression of opposition, devastating wars with neighboring countries, and systematic persecution of ethnic and religious minorities. The man who once commanded absolute power over 26 million Iraqis would soon face the ultimate justice for his crimes. The beginning of the end came on March 20th, 2003, when American-led coalition forces launched Operation Iraqi Freedom, toppling Saddam's government within weeks. The dictator, who had survived assassination attempts, coups, and international sanctions, finally met his match in the form of overwhelming military force. For 8 months after the fall of Baghdad, Saddam remained a fugitive, constantly moving between safe houses and hideouts across his former domain. Captured in a spider-hole Operation Red Dawn, named after the 1984 American film, culminated on December 13, 2003, when Task Force 121 finally located their high-value target. The massive manhunt involving 150,000 troops and countless intelligence operations led them to a modest farmhouse near Ad-Dar, south of Tikrit. What they found would become one of the most iconic images of the Iraq War. The once mighty dictator, pulled from a cramped underground hideout, disheveled and defeated. The spider hole, as it came to be known, was barely large enough for a man to lie down in. Farmer Al-Anamik had hidden Saddam for 235 days, even serving as his personal hairdresser, while American forces scoured the countryside. When soldiers finally dragged him from his hiding place at 8:30 p.m. local time, Saddam offered no resistance, a stark contrast to the defiant leader who had once threatened to turn Iraq into America's Vietnam. The crime that sealed his fate, while Saddam faced numerous charges for atrocities committed during his reign, it was the relatively obscure Dujail massacre that would ultimately send him to the gallows. On July 8, 1982, during the early years of the devastating Iran-Iraq War, Saddam had visited the small Shiite town of Dujail, 35 miles north of Baghdad, in what appeared to be a routine public relations visit. The trip began normally, with official cameras capturing Saddam meeting families, patting children's heads, and addressing cheering crowds from the local Ba'ath Party headquarters. However, as his convoy prepared to leave town, members of the militant Shiite group Dawa launched an ambush from roadside palm groves. Though Saddam escaped unharmed, his retaliation would be swift and merciless. What followed was a systematic campaign of terror against Dujail's residents. Saddam personally returned to interrogate villagers, with his own cameraman capturing these chilling moments. Over the following weeks, Iraqi security forces arrested more than 300 people, including entire families. Many were tortured at detention centers, where approximately 1/3 died from their injuries. The survivors were sent to a remote desert internment camp for 4 years before being transferred to the Revolutionary Court. In a mockery of justice, 148 men and boys were sentenced to death without a proper trial and subsequently executed. Saddam's forces completed their punishment by destroying the town's orchards, date palm groves, and water supply, ensuring that Dujail would bear permanent scars from the dictator's wrath. Justice delayed. The Iraqi High Tribunal, established specifically to prosecute crimes committed by the Ba'ath regime, began Saddam's trial on October 19, 2005. The proceedings were televised gavel to gavel throughout Iraq, transforming the courtroom into a theater where the country's traumatic past played out in real time. Saddam, ever defiant, regularly disrupted proceedings, shouting at judges and questioning the court's legitimacy. The trial faced numerous challenges that highlighted the chaotic state of post-invasion Iraq. 3 defense lawyers were assassinated during the proceedings, forcing frequent delays and security measures. Witnesses faced intimidation, and the entire judicial process unfolded against the backdrop of a raging insurgency that claimed thousands of lives monthly. Despite these obstacles, the evidence against Saddam proved overwhelming. Prosecutors presented official documents bearing his signature, testimony from survivors, and the dictator's own filmed interrogations of Dujail residents. The defense's attempts to discredit witnesses backfired when several were exposed as imposters recruited to provide false testimony. The verdict and final appeals on November 5, 2006. After 13 months of proceedings, the 5-judge panel delivered its verdict. As the chief judge read the sentence, Saddam was forced to stand and listen as his fate was sealed. The court decides to sentence Saddam Hussein to death by hanging for committing willful killing as a crime against humanity, the judge announced. Saddam's response was characteristically defiant. "Long live the people. Long live the Ummah. Down with the spies. God is great." The courtroom erupted as bailiffs struggled to maintain order while the former dictator continued his outbursts. Along with Saddam, his half-brother Barzan al-Tikriti and former Revolutionary Court Judge Awad al-Bandar also received death sentences. The mandatory appeals process that followed was swift by Iraqi judicial standards. On December 26, 2006, the appeals court upheld all 3 death sentences and ordered their execution within 30 days. Iraqi law required that the sentences be carried out regardless of any other ongoing trials, setting the clock ticking towards Saddam's final appointment with justice. The final hours as news of the impending execution spread, the world's media descended upon Baghdad in an unprecedented death watch. Cable news channels provided round-the-clock coverage, with anchors speculating about timing and procedures, while cameramen waited outside government buildings for any sign of movement. The execution was scheduled for the first day of Eid al-Adha, Islam's holiest festival, a decision that would later draw sharp criticism from across the Muslim world. On December 29th, Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki signed Saddam's death warrant, officially sealing his fate. The dictator spent his final hours in an American detention facility, where he met with his half-brother Watban Ibrahim Hassan al-Tikriti to hand over his will and personal belongings. His last meal consisted of chicken and rice with a cup of hot water and honey, simple fare for a man who had once lived in palaces. In his final letter to the Iraqi people, Saddam urged unity in the face of sectarian violence and asked his countrymen not to hate the nations that had invaded Iraq, but rather their decision-makers. He declared himself ready to die as a martyr and expressed peace with his death sentence, attempting to control his legacy even in his final moments. Dawn at the gallows at approximately 5:50 a.m. local time on December 30, 2006, Saddam Hussein was led to the gallows at Camp Justice in Baghdad's Qazimain district. The execution chamber, located at the joint Iraqi-US military base, had been prepared according to Iraqi judicial protocols, with 2 masked executioners standing ready to carry out the sentence. The official Iraqi government video showed Saddam walking calmly up the stairs to the gallows, displaying none of the fear that many expected from the former dictator. He wore a black overcoat and appeared composed as the executioners placed the noose around his neck. The official footage ended just before the trapdoor opened, cutting away from the moment of death. However, it was an unofficial recording that would shock the world and generate lasting controversy. A mobile phone video, allegedly filmed by one of the guards present, captured the complete execution, including audio of Saddam's final moments. The footage revealed that several witnesses had taunted the condemned man as he stood on the gallows, shouting sectarian slogans and praising Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. In his final exchange, as voices jeered around him, Saddam responded with characteristic defiance, "God damn you." Moments later, the trapdoor opened, and the man who had terrorized Iraq for nearly 3 decades plunged through the gallows floor. The execution was complete, but the controversy was just beginning. Global shockwaves within hours of the execution, the unauthorized mobile phone footage had spread across the internet and television screens worldwide. The leaked video revealed a chaotic scene that stood in stark contrast to the dignified judicial process that Iraqi and American officials had promised. Instead of the solemn conclusion to a legal proceeding, viewers witnessed what appeared to be a sectarian lynching, complete with taunts and sectarian chants. The timing of the execution on Eid al-Adha drew immediate condemnation from across the Muslim world. Saudi Arabia's Al-Ikhbariyah, television station expressed surprise and disapproval that the verdict has been applied during the holy months and the first days of Eid al-Adha, calling on Islamic leaders to show respect for this blessed occasion. The decision to proceed with the execution during Islam's most sacred holiday was seen as deliberately provocative and disrespectful. International human rights organizations and legal experts criticized both the trial process and the execution itself. United Nations human rights experts expressed concerns about the fairness of the proceedings and called for reforms to Iraq's judicial system. The hasty nature of the execution, carried out just 4 days after the appeals court ruling, raised questions about whether justice had truly been served or whether political considerations had overridden legal procedures. President George W. Bush, who had invested enormous political capital in the Iraq War, issued a measured statement defending the execution as the product of a fair trial. Today, Saddam Hussein was executed after receiving a fair trial, the kind of justice he denied the victims of his brutal regime, Bush declared. Though privately administration, officials were reportedly dismayed by the chaotic circumstances surrounding the dictator's death. The aftermath and legacy. Saddam's body was returned to his birthplace of Al-Auja, near Tikrit, on December 31, 2006, where it was buried in a simple grave near other family members. The modest burial site stood in stark contrast to the grandiose monuments the dictator had erected to himself throughout Iraq during his reign. Later reports suggested that his body had been stabbed 6 times after death. Though these claims could not be independently verified, the execution failed to achieve the closure that many Iraqis and Americans had hoped for. Rather than marking the definitive end of Iraq's violent chapter, Saddam's death occurred amid a raging civil war that would continue for years. The sectarian taunts captured in the execution video seemed to symbolize the deeper divisions that plagued Iraqi society, divisions that Saddam had exploited during his rule and that persisted long after his death. For the families of Dujail, the execution provided some measure of justice for crimes committed nearly 25 years earlier. Survivors who had testified against Saddam expressed satisfaction that the man who had destroyed their community had finally been held accountable. Yet even this long-awaited justice was tempered by the knowledge that Saddam would never face trial for his other crimes, including the genocide against the Kurds and the suppression of the 1991 Shiite uprising. The execution of Saddam Hussein marked the end of one of the 20th century's most notorious dictatorships, but it also highlighted the challenges of delivering justice in a society torn apart by decades of oppression and war. The leaked footage of his final moments served as a stark reminder that even in death, Saddam Hussein remained a divisive figure whose legacy would continue to haunt Iraq for generations to come. The image of the former dictator standing defiantly on the gallows, facing death with the same stubbornness that had characterized his reign, became the final chapter in a story that had begun with such promise and ended in such tragedy. For better or worse, Saddam Hussein's execution on that December morning became a defining moment in Iraq's troubled journey toward democracy. A moment when justice was served, but at the cost of revealing the deep wounds that still divided the nation. He had once ruled with absolute power.